Opening the diagonal for the queen and king's bishop immediately contests the center. Unlocking the bishop's diagonal, this pawn establishes a flexible defense, sidestepping early tactical skirmishes but potentially ceding central space. Opening up central diagonals, white immediately stakes a claim for the board's core. Knight's rapid development challenges the center, potentially disrupting white's pawn structure and preparing for kingside activity. Developing the knight here establishes central presence, eyeing crucial squares and preparing to contest the pawn majority. Embarking on the fianchetto, black signals a commitment to a robust kingside defense and long-term pressure on the queenside diagonal. Aggressively seizing central space, this pawn thrust launches a daring pawn storm, potentially overextending, but aiming to dismantle black's fianchetto structure and expose the king. Developing the bishop to its natural outpost, this piece now eyes the d4 pawn and prepares for potential castling. Fortifying the kingside center, this natural development eyes further pressure along the e4-d5 diagonal. Securing the king becomes paramount now, safely tucking it away behind the pawn shield. Developing the bishop to its most active diagonal, this piece now eyes the kingside and supports the central pawns, preparing for potential pawn storms or queenside expansion later in the game. Aggressively challenging the center with c5, black immediately seeks to dismantle white's pawn structure, creating dynamic imbalances and opening lines for their pieces. This thrust aims to disrupt white's harmonious development and seize initiative by creating queenside counterplay. Sacrificing the pawn immediately opens the d-file and aims to disrupt black's pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses around the kingside. White gambits material for initiative, hoping to exploit the central tension and faster development rather than solidifying pawn chains. This aggressive exchange tests black's ability to defend against rapid piece play. Challenging white's central pawn push, black instantly leverages the open diagonal to pressure the newly exposed c3 knight and potentially disrupt white's queenside development. This aggressive counterplay aims to exploit the slight disarray caused by the recent exchange and reclaim initiative. Securing the monarch behind a pawn wall now allows white to consolidate material and prepare for central pawn breaks, anticipating black's potential counterplay with pieces like the queen. Capturing the pawn now, though it seems natural, opens up diagonals for your queen and potentially exposes your king. Consider the coordination of your pieces. Is there a more harmonious development that would build pressure without creating such immediate vulnerabilities? Think about how this pawn grab influences the pawn structure and the control of central squares. Securing the king, a prudent retreat from the immediate check, while simultaneously preparing for potential future threats down the newly opened file that will soon become a battlefield. Black reestablishes piece coordination, aiming to activate the queenside and contest central influence now that the immediate tactical storm has subsided, preparing for potential pawn pushes. Securing the knight on d2 offers a stable platform, rerouting it perhaps to f3 or even c4 to bolster the kingside or exert pressure on the queenside. This is a solidifying maneuver, preparing to consolidate the pawn structure and potentially launch a slow, methodical advance. A bold attempt to seize queenside space, challenging white's central control and potentially creating a passed pawn. Asserting control over the queenside is the primary goal here, aiming to restrict black's active pieces like the queen and potentially the rook on a8. By pushing the pawn, white attempts to create a pawn chain that cramps black's space and limits their counterplay on that flank, while also preparing for potential pawn advances later in the game. This move might also indirectly address the tension around the c5 square, making it less inviting for black to re-establish pressure there. A cunning repositioning begins, aiming to dislodge white's knight from its comfortable central square and introduce potential pressure on the queenside. A pivot towards controlling the d5 square, seeking to dislodge black's pressure and potentially exploit the weakened queenside pawns. Consolidating the queen on b6 offers a more active posture, indirectly pressuring the d4 pawn while simultaneously preparing to redeploy towards the queenside, potentially for a later b5 advance, creating a more expansive structure. Launching a pawn storm on the kingside signals a bold, aggressive intent, aiming to shatter black's defensive shell and pry open lines towards the enemy monarch, though it simultaneously weakens white's own king's safety. Seizing the open file and initiating an aggressive pawn probe, black immediately challenges white's newly established pawn wall and attempts to disrupt white's coordination, gambling on the potential for tactical opportunities that arise from this bold pawn sacrifice. A vital central pawn now falls, but your king is exposed to a potentially devastating crossfire as black's knight embarks on an audacious journey, aiming to infiltrate the queenside with newfound freedom. Reclaiming that pawn with the knight initiates a dynamic skirmish, immediately challenging white's central pawn structure and forcing a decision about the f4 pawn's advanced position. Observe how the knight's presence on g4 now potentially targets the e3 square, adding tactical complexity to the otherwise solid pawn chain. Initiating a bold recapture, white reclaims the pawn lost in the previous exchange, establishing a centralized queen that immediately surveys the board's central thoroughfares, creating potential attacking lanes toward black's castled king, while simultaneously forcing a reevaluation of piece development and pawn structure dynamics as the position continues to open. A bold foray into enemy territory, this knight sacrifices itself for a tactical skirmish, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious development and exploit a potential weakness around the c-pawn's absence. While it momentarily distracts the queen and opens a diagonal, the underlying positional cost might be significant, leaving black's king potentially exposed if white can consolidate effectively. It's a daring gambit, betting on immediate complications over solid structure. Targeting the exposed queen with the knight repositions that piece to a far more active square, indirectly preparing a queenside pawn push while also forcing a decision from black regarding their already somewhat scattered forces. An aggressive pawn sacrifice to disrupt white's queen and rook coordination, aiming to gain material by capturing the rook on the file, but it leaves black's king potentially exposed and sacrifices crucial central control. Recapturing the knight on a1 immediately resolves the tactical intrusion, solidifying white's material advantage and beginning the process of simplifying the position. This action not only prevents black from further harassing the queenside, but also opens the possibility of activating the rook that was tied down to defending the knight. The initiative has now firmly shifted back to white, who can focus on consolidating their extra pawn and preparing for a more controlled middle game. Unbalancing the material on the queenside with a pawn for a knight, black aims to exploit the newly created queenside weaknesses, but must be acutely aware of white's potential for rapid development and king's safety issues arising from the pawn structure. Unleashing a pawn storm, white seeks to exploit the open f-file and create immediate attacking opportunities against black's uncastled king, daring black to engage in a sharp tactical battle. This aggressive foray of the queen to c4, while seemingly active, injects significant instability into black's position, potentially opening up avenues for white's pieces with the now undefended c7 pawn and the exposed king on g8. Sharpening the focus on that isolated central pawn, qf3 prepares to potentially challenge black's queenside advantage and simultaneously bolsters the kingside defense, aiming to squeeze black's position by controlling key squares. Reclaiming lost material is a tempting instinct, but this capture creates significant long-term positional issues for black. The queenside is now severely weakened with doubled pawns and an exposed king, while white's pieces are poised to exploit the open files and centralized knight. Consider the potential for white to generate dangerous attacking chances along the kingside and central diagonals. Asserting dominance on the 7th rank, white aims to disrupt black's queenside structure and initiate a powerful kingside assault, leveraging the open f-file while keeping the knight actively positioned to threaten further incursings. Sacrificing the queen for material has led to a wild exchange of blows, and now black, seemingly up material, faces a significant positional challenge. The queen's excursion to a1, while capturing another pawn, leaves the kingside potentially exposed to white's advancing pawns, and the knight on b4 suddenly looks a little lonely. Unlocking a dangerous central thrust, white pivots the knight to a square that simultaneously threatens the black queen and opens up the d-file for potential future aggression. This knight repositioning is a subtle but powerful injection of dynamism, aiming to disrupt black's recently established pawn structure and create tactical opportunities on the queen side. White is looking to exploit the temporary disarray following black's ambitious queen excursion, seeking to force concessions or create weaknesses around the beleaguered monarch. A bold choice, bringing the rook into the fray on the open e-file, aiming to create immediate counterplay against White's potentially exposed king after the pawns storm on the king side. This maneuver boldly challenges White's central control and injects a new layer of dynamic tension into the position. Seizing the initiative on the king side, this maneuver aims to exploit Black's still undeveloped queen's flank and potentially create a protected passed pawn on the g-file. It directly challenges the bishop's influence, forcing Black to either react defensively or risk immediate concessions. A bold recapture that sacrifices a pawn for immediate counterplay, aiming to disrupt White's coordination and exploit the exposed king. Exploiting the temporary undefended square, this move aims to disrupt Black's rook activity on the open e-file and create a dangerous battery with the bishop already on g5, potentially threatening Black's king if it remains in its current position. Unveiling a new attacker for the king's fortress, this bishop relocation aims to solidify the queenside pawn structure while simultaneously preparing to contest the crucial open c-file. Repositioning the rook to the open file offers a potent threat of infiltration, aiming to exploit the exposed king by creating potential mating nets or overwhelming the defenders. A desperate thunderbolt across the chessboard, aiming to shatter the momentarily vulnerable White king and create chaos before White consolidates. The rook retreats, a subtle but crucial recalibration, as the king's exposed position and the looming danger of Black's central majority demand White's immediate attention, prioritizing king's safety over material recovery. The immediate threat of discovery against the king is now diffused, but Black's queen is precariously placed, potentially becoming a target for a swift repositioning of White's knights once the immediate skirmish subsides. The rook's retreat on the 7th rank, now unburdened by the threat on the file, seeks refuge on h3, potentially preparing a subtle regrouping or aiming to bolster the king's safety by creating an escape square, even as the central files remain hotly contested. Cracking open the kingside pawn structure with this advance signals a bold attempt to destabilize White's central control and expose the enemy monarch to potential future assaults, even at the cost of creating a slightly weakened pawn chain for Black's own forces. Seizing the initiative by removing the active defender, White disrupts Black's potential for counterplay and consolidates their material advantage, aiming to exploit the open files and the weakened king position. The rook's repositioning finally secures a foothold on the open file, a crucial development for launching counterplay against White's somewhat exposed king. A desperate attempt to lure the opponent's king into open lines, hoping to disrupt Black's coordination with a surprise attack, though the piece sacrifice may prove insufficient given the material disadvantage and Black's strong central pawn structure. Shifting the monarch to the edge of the board creates a potential sanctuary, albeit a precarious one, as it seeks to escape the immediate thunder of the knight's fork and sidestep the looming threat of an early discovered attack from the rook. Unleashing a knight into the enemy's territory, this move aims to disrupt Black's carefully constructed defense around their king by sacrificing material for initiative. The knight's placement on f5 attacks the crucial g7 bishop and opens avenues for further incursions, threatening to cascade into a decisive attack. It's a bold gambit designed to exploit the currently exposed Black king and the slightly uncoordinated piece placement of Black. A desperate attempt to weave some magic into a collapsing position, this queen maneuver offers a fleeting glimmer of counterplay, but largely ignores the crushing reality of the king's exposed state and the overwhelming material deficit. Seizing the open file is paramount. Pushing the rook to g1 intends to exploit the weakened kingside, creating immediate threats against Black's huddled monarch and potentially opening lines for further assaults. Opening up the queenside pawn structure now seems to be Black's priority, seeking to activate the rook and create counterplay where White's king is still somewhat exposed. Unleashing the rook on the fourth rank opens up the possibility of harassing the black king from an unexpected angle. Shifting the queen back into the fray, seeking opportunities along the queenside's open avenues, and perhaps eyeing that exposed white king once more. Strategically, white repositions the queen to a safer square, anticipating a potential discovery with the rook on g1 and the knight on e7. This regrouping aims to consolidate defensive resources while preserving the initiative, potentially preparing for further central thrusts or the activation of the rook on the open g-file. Pushing that pawn forward creates a dynamic tension on the queen side, potentially threatening to break through white's pawn structure and open lines for black's rook on the file. Shifting the rook from the active central file opens up a surprising tactical avenue, aiming to disrupt black's advanced queen and potentially trap it, while simultaneously preparing a kingside advance. A bold sacrifice to disrupt white's pieces, aiming to cripple their coordination and exploit the exposed king.